contrast the following statements. A person confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound with a wheelchair user. Notice how these statements could refer to the same individual, but the language used confers demonstrably different views about the individual. Disability advocates have raised awareness about language, pointing to the role of language in maintaining and reinforcing social barriers that inhibit access and inclusion, regardless of any legal change. And so let's reflect on spoken language and its role in the process of working for disability justice. Consider how the terms we use are all socially constructed and they're embedded with judgments. These are culturally encoded messages, even if one is unconscious of those messages. Again, think about how you learned language, right? You just slowly pick this up as a child over time, if whatever your first language was, and you may have picked up a second or a third language along the way. But in particular, that first language, you're absorbing the culture with the language at the same time. And it is this process that develops from the time that we are children. So one may not intend to demean or condemn, but through the language used, one has become an unwitting marionette of the dominant cultural views that are embedded throughout the language. In some areas of language, in the spheres of race and gender and sexuality in particular, thanks to advocacy for cultural change, there's been much scrutiny and increased awareness about the impact of language. And that has produced a greater sensitivity and a general shift away from some terms which have been in common parlance a generation before, but we now recognize them as inappropriate and offensive. And we've replaced them with other terms that are more commonly and properly used. But if we examine the sphere of disability, we find a much slower pace of awareness and a disinterest or even a resistance to change by society at large. In the 1960s, psychiatrist Thomas Szasz pointed to the power of language, saying, "If in the animal kingdom it is eat or be eaten, in the kingdom of humans, it is define or be defined." Language asserts a hierarchy of power. It reflects the dominant society's views about disability. The language encodes ableist ideas, which is why we need to reflect on these terms and language used with respect to disability. Now, we can look all the way back to the 19th century when the medical terminology used to define people who today we would recognize with neurological, developmental, or intellectual disabilities, but were then referred to as imbeciles, idiots, and feeble-minded. Now, these were technical terms. These were the terms used in the medical community. But the general culture adopted those terms for use as pejoratives, as insults, as they are used today. From medical classification to popular insult. This would be a recurring pattern with respect to disability, but not with other forms of medical classification. Now later, these words, imbecile, idiot, and feeble-minded, were phased out for other terms for medical classification. And for much of the 20th century, mental retardation became a medical classification, and in the same way, this was adopted by the culture and stamped as a pejorative, and it's used to demean and insult. So consider what these messages are. And what's being conveyed about disability? How does this affect the relationship between people with disabilities and the non-disabled? How might this impact all parties? And in particular, how does this impact the person with developmental or other disabilities? Now, we can explore this similarly with other dimensions of disability. How disability has been commonly used for negative analogies in the language. When someone doesn't understand something or is unable to follow a particular guideline, the culture offers expressions like, "Are you deaf? Are you blind?" The culture weaves together messages about disability and ignorance, disability and inefficiency, disability and incapability. With disability used for negative analogies, this communicates the cultural values in operation. And this course has sought to raise awareness and encourages you to challenge the cultural stigma that has plagued disability. Now let's remember that stigma is not in our biology, but in our culture. It's not inevitable. It's not hardwired into us. We learn it in our community, and we reinforce it with language that we uncritically use, unaware of the barriers that we are building by using words that demean and marginalize. But with awareness, there's hope of understanding as we weed out the roots of ableism to promote inclusion in our language as much as in our laws and policies.